Welcome to my Friend the Rainbow Circle episode number 51. Longtime fans, my millions and millions and millions of fans, will remember I did an episode a while ago about how I watched Malcolm Gladwell's masterclass and how his concept of filling out a puzzle and the missing puzzle piece, something that really drives you through a story, whether you find the puzzle piece or not. And I was struck by just how much more effective that was and more accurate that was in understanding just the nature of storytelling than um, the Neil Gaiman masterclass that I watched, where he sort of boiled everything down to um, learning lessons and learning how to work in the real world and what have you, which is very disappointing that he was so inaccurate. Um, in many ways, before I really engaged in any sort of Malcolm Gladwell stuff, I would have wanted really to side with Neil Gaiman over Malcolm Gladwell because I like fantasy fiction more than nonfiction, just personally. And so I've just this whole year, I've been engaging in a lot of what Malcolm Gladwell wrote and recorded. But I ran across an inaccuracy, a problem with his understanding of how songs work. And there are a lot of things that you could say about how fiction works that you could translate to how songs work. I don't know that whole lot about music. Not a music expert. That's one of my worst subjects in really understanding how it works. But I think ultimately, if you're trying to figure out how any sort of art works, there's a level of understanding that really should apply to any sort of artwork. And my millions of fans will know I talked in a previous episode about how meditating on Mark Rothko paintings and saying how can we understand a piece of fiction as working the same way as a Mark Rothko painting. That was a really helpful sort of meditation to try to figure out the basic value of a piece of art. But he had an episode of his podcast where he was talking about how he made the claim that good music is specific, which is absurd. The bad kind of absurd, unfortunately. And he used as an example Wild Horses by the Rolling Stones, a song I love. And he compared that to He Stopped Loving Her Today, which is a great song. And his claim was that He Stopped Loving Her Today was a sadder song than Wild Horses because it was more specific. And that's a purely objective determination. But it's a great example of a lot of the false universals that come up with post-rationalization. And I talked about in the last episode about post-rationalization, the whole idea that if you like or dislike something, you have an irrational response. So if you hear Wild Horses, whether or not you like it or dislike it is rooted in just an irrational response that you have to it, just emotional, visceral response. I like that because it makes me feel sad. It's a stimulation that disregards the dualistic distinction, the dualistic good-bad distinction. Being made to feel sad is an enjoyable experience, irrationally enjoyable experience, because it stimulates an emotional response. Our post-rationalization tells us that feeling sad is a bad thing. Therefore, we're being irrational to feel sad. So there's a lot of difficulty in our really basic understanding of how songs work, how sad songs work, why we would listen to sad songs. And so my response would be that I love Wild Horses and He Stopped Loving Her Today because they make me feel these intense feelings on a purely irrational level. And Malcolm Gladwell said, comparing those two directly, he said, what makes He Stopped Loving Her Today better is its specificity, which makes no sense at all. He failed to actually prove that that's a legitimate universal. I would say it's a false universal, but the common sort of false universal you hear a lot in resulting from the post-rationalization that happens in assessing the value of an art piece, which is really, really common. But the way you would test to see if that actually works goes back to another episode. which is just a handy sort of a thing to use in any sort of assessment of value in art. The Mogollon, I call it the Mogollon, but basically you take any sort of claim that you make. You analyze a piece and you say, I think maybe the reason I like this piece is for this, this, and this. And you take that and you test whether or not it's universal. So if you listen to He Stopped Loving Her Today, and your response is, this must be so sad because it's so specific. I'm still trying to wrap my head around how that actually works, but I like the song because it's specific. Would you take that same response and just independently find another really sad song that you like? I'm not sure exactly what sad songs Malcolm Gladwell likes, but could you conceivably take that and apply it to Hurt by Nine Inch Nails and Johnny Cash? Or could you apply it to Everybody Hurts by REM? I'm just thinking of these random sad songs. I just subconsciously, these are the ones I'm accessing for some reason. Or any one of the Blower's Daughter by Damien Rice. I love that song. I'm just accessing these random sad songs. Would you listen to Hurt and say, would that be your first instinct and say, I must like Hurt by Nine Inch Nails and later recorded by Johnny Cash. I must like that song because it's so specific. Well, no, that would be ridiculous. But if you said, I like that song because on a purely visceral, irrational level, it makes me feel these intense emotions, just in a highly personal, subjective way, that is going to be different from what anybody else feels. It's unformulizable. Could you take that as a universal? And then if you listen to another one of the songs, would that be the same answer that you give? That's just a real simple test for, what could function as a legitimate universal. That's just a way of avoiding post-rationalization, because a lot of the times when we have this irrational response to something, a totally valid response to any sort of art piece, to have an irrational emotional response, I totally, completely validate just the value of the irrational emotional response. If you have that irrational emotional response and then you think afterwards, why did I have that response? Why was that such a good, sad song? A lot of the times when you try to come up with an answer, it will turn into a false universal. So just a way of testing it is just to ask yourself, is this genuinely something that I could apply to any sort of sad song? And if it's not, it just might be a personal thing for you. I mean, like Malcolm Gladwell just might, on an entirely personal level, he might just like very specific sad songs. The problem is that he says all sad songs must be specific. That makes no sense. Whereas if you made the claim that if you come to some self-realization that as a fan of music, the type of music I personally like is very specific sad music, that would be exponentially more valid and useful on an entirely personal level, but you wouldn't then be able to take that and assess somebody else's song. You would be able to say, in translating that to something like a fiction workshop, you wouldn't be able to say, good sad songs are specific. Your song is not specific, therefore it's not a good sad song. That's entirely inaccurate. That's just your personal taste, but that's entirely inaccurate. That happens very, very, very frequently, but it's one of the big problems that happens in assessment of creative pieces, and we definitely need to stop doing that. Just as artists, we need to recognize and appreciate and validate the irrationality of visceral responses, and just allow people to love the things that they love, no matter just how different they might be from our personal taste. That's my political message of the day, I guess. I'm sure I'm going to talk about scary movies at some point, but that's definitely true of scary movies. So, what scares an individual person or is enjoyable about a scary movie for an individual person is radically different from person to person. But we have this tendency to say the only scary thing is this. Therefore, you must be foolish to think this other thing is scary. That's just an unproductive, inaccurate way to really treat any sort of art. But that's my 2 cents for the day. I'll see you on the next episode.